In a previous video, the 8th video in this series, I mentioned to you that I wanted to talk a little bit more about the life of the Apostle Paul and things he said and did. Paul is a really important figure in the history of the Christian church. Paul, as I mentioned, calls himself throughout his earlier life as an adult a persecutor of the Christian church. He used to be someone who was opposed to the Christian church. Eventually, he became known as a Christian. He was a man who planted a number of churches and spread this message of the faith that is known as Christianity across the Mediterranean world. He began doing that sometime, we would say, in the late 30s, early 40s AD, and he stopped doing it when he was executed sometime in the mid-60s AD, executed for doing exactly that, for being an apostle of Christianity. Some people will make an odd, frankly, claim. They will say something like, Paul invented Christianity. I have a couple of responses to that. One would be that Paul clearly did not invent Christianity because he joined a movement that already existed, which he had been persecuting. Paul cannot be the straight-up inventor of Christianity because there was already a movement occurring, a group of people who were gathering around a particular message and this figure Jesus, whom Paul was opposed to, and then joined. So Paul cannot have invented Christianity. Some people, though, when they make this particular claim, Paul invented Christianity, they mean something, to be fair, a little more nuanced. They would mean Paul took this Jesus movement and changed the direction of it. I might even be inclined to agree with that, to a certain extent. To say that by the work that the Apostle Paul carried out, the direction of the Jesus movement changed, I would be okay with saying that. I would simply say that that happened, though, at Jesus' command, by Jesus' will, and it happened according to the direction that Jesus wanted his movement to unfold. A few of the things that Paul in particular is known for teaching in the books of the Bible that he wrote are reasons that people would question this. People will say, well, Jesus preached a particular message that's distinct in very specific and important ways, they would say, from the message of Jesus. I'm going to focus on two that I've heard suggested before. If you've heard others suggest that there's some emphasis in Paul's teaching that's not found in the teaching of Jesus, let me know. I would love to address those. The two that I'm going to look at are the ideas that there is justification by faith apart from works, and secondly, the idea of heaven and hell, of eternity for the human soul, and really for the resurrected person as well. The first one, justification by faith, not through works. That's a formula that the Apostle Paul very much in particular emphasizes. Justification comes about, he says, by faith and not by works. Justification is the declaration of our innocence in the eyes of God. Now people will say, Jesus did not teach a justification that was by faith, not by works. Jesus focused on how we live life and how that puts us right in the eyes of God, some people will suggest. Jesus did have many, many things to say about how we ought to live. In fact, this Sunday I'm going to be preaching on some of Jesus' words, talking about how his followers ought to live. Nonetheless, we can find in the teachings of Jesus the idea that justification is delivered to us through faith and not through works. Two examples I'll give. There's a man who's generally known as the thief on the cross. When Jesus was being executed, two criminals were hanging on either side of him on their own crosses. And after the afternoon's events had largely unfolded toward the end for these three men, their two lives and Jesus' own nearing their ends, one of them, struck by the fact, seemingly, that he knows he's about to die, turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This man, we're told, it was a robber, a bandit, someone who attacked people as they traveled on the roads and stole their possessions and left them for dead. A bad guy. He asks Jesus to remember him when Jesus comes into his kingdom, and Jesus looks over at him and says, recounted for us in the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, "You will be with me today in paradise." In other words, this man can be assured of his justification, of his right standing before God, because he has trusted in Jesus' mercy without any works of his own. An example of justification by faith, works absent. Another spot where we can find such an emphasis in the teaching of Jesus would be John chapter 3, where in a conversation with a man named Nicodemus, Jesus talks about how everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. That brings me into my next point. Some people will suggest that the idea of heaven and hell is absent from Jesus' own teaching, that it's Paul who comes up with this idea of hell and damnation awaiting all people. Well, John chapter 3, Jesus clearly states, we are naturally going to perish. It is through belief in him that we can enjoy everlasting life. Another place where we can find this emphasis in Jesus' own teaching would be in Matthew chapter 25, in a portion known as the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus separates all people at the end of the world into two groups and says, to one, you will be away from me. You will not live with me. You will suffer for eternity. And to the other group, he says, you will be with me. You will live in joy and peace with me and my Father forever at the wedding feast that is prepared for me in heaven. Just a couple of ways in which we see the accusation that the Apostle Paul invented Christianity doesn't really stack up. He taught things that we find in Jesus' own teaching. He joined a movement that already existed. How can we say really credibly that he invented Christianity? In my next video, we'll take a look at the New Testament writings, Paul's and others, and talk about the things that we might call textual transmission issues, what we call variant reading, spots where we're not maybe sure in one particular place what exactly was written by these original writers, Paul, Peter, these other men. But that's going to be the subject of another video. See you next time.